Hi, Scott. Hello,
Man.
listeners. Hi there. You've got a pretty sweet collection of vinyl there behind you. It looks pretty cool. Do you have anything by the Shoes in there?
I don't even know who the Shoes are. This
Oh,
is
they're a great power pop band. Great power pop. I'm sure you'll love it when you
from what
check it out.
era?
Like early '80s, early '80s. Like I think their debut came out like '80 or '81. Um, Really cool, solid stuff. You'll love it.
I love that recommendation. Thanks, man. This is a small part of a larger collection. I have about 5,000 records in another room, and I unfortunately had to do a move recently, and it took 52 boxes to get them all out, and I do not recommend ever doing that.
Yeah, I have a decent amount of vinyl, so I can relate to that. But my entire collection is probably somewhere around the half of what you have there. Do you have four stacks there behind you?
Yeah, I think five.
Okay,
One, two, three. Yeah, no, four. Four. Yeah.
I've got yeah, I probably have about half as much as what I can see behind you there. But I leave all my vinyl in Arizona. It's with my brother. When my marriage fell apart, I had to move my stuff, and that was one thing I decided I could just kind of turn my back on for the time being. But I know it's in good hands. It's with my brother, and it's a pretty nice collection of vinyl. I worked in record stores all through the 1980s.
Yeah,
And so my experience in the 80s was like a John Hughes movie. And uh, one of the three record stores I worked at specialized in vintage vinyl. So my collection of original pressings, all my favorite bands, I got all their debut records on vinyl, stuff like Bowie and Petty and Queen. And I've just obviously always been a fan of vinyl in particular. But now I honestly don't miss it too much. I'm perfectly happy to be all digital.
yeah,
So
easy to
go
stream.
figure.
Well, I'd love to start the story with the record stores because that's ultimately where the Gin Blossoms or your intersection with them began. So you
Yeah,
were the original by working in a record store in the 1980s. I mean, obviously, long before streaming, you were the original algorithm. You were the tastemaker who would provide people like me and others the recommendations. It
that
must have
is
been a
true,
pretty
and
amazing time.
it was, and you touched on something there. One of the best things about working in the record store is when people would come in and you could help them select new music. Is there was it was traditional for a lot of customers to simply just go to the record store every week and buy new records, and some people would come in not knowing exactly what they wanted, and you'd have a brief conversation with them. What was the last thing you bought? What's your favorite stuff? And being able to help someone, uh, I'll never forget this one particular time where somebody, they I can't remember exactly who they told me they were fans of, but I remember helping them pick out uh, the latest record from Joe Jackson.
Mhm.
And I just knew that based on their taste that they were going to absolutely love this Joe Jackson record. And then people would come in and they'd say, "Well, I'm really into Skinny Puppy," and I'd be like, "Oh, well, have you heard the Sisters of Mercy? You're going to dig this." So though that was a very rewarding part of working in the record stores, but probably the biggest advantage was that you got to hear everything.
Yeah.
So when I was working at Tower Records, that was my first job in a record store. I started there right out of high school in 1983, and they at first they put me in charge of the classical music. So I learned a great deal about classical music, and then they moved me over to folk, blues, and bluegrass. And so I was in charge of the folk, blues, and bluegrass section for the remainder of my time at Tower Records for like another couple of years. So I got to know that music very well. and so many great labels for that type of music in those days, like Alligator Records and Rounder Records and Flying Fish. And uh, it was cool because if you were running that section, you could ask those distributors for like a T-shirt. So I was so proud of my Flying Fish Records T-shirt because it identified me as someone with a very specific skill set. And you know, so that was great. We're hearing all of the new music. I went into Tower Records, you know, like a pretty typical Pepsi generation 19-year-old, uh, listening to things like Billy Idol and Duran Duran. And then you're immediately exposed to like true alternative music, things like, say, the Violent Femmes, and it really helped expand my knowledge of what music was and helped to improve and round out my taste as a listener. And about a year after starting at Tower Records, our Jim Blossom's bass player Bill Lean got a job there at the store. And he and I had gone to the same high school. He was a few years ahead of me, and so I didn't really know him. I had met him a few times, but I didn't know him until he started working at Tower Records, and we were close friends there. And then I was also working there with two of my closest friends that I eventually formed a band with, like just before I joined Jim Blossoms. I finally started my dream band with my two buddies, Dan and Brian. And then years later, when the Jim Blossoms were at the top of the charts, Dan and Brian and I formed a band called Gas Giants.
Yep.
And we actually we had a cover band that we named after one of our fellow Tower Records employees. We were called the Swaffords. And then a few years later, when Jim Blossoms broke up for a few years, I formed Gas Giants with my buddies. But yes, as you say, to get back to it, in a lot of ways, Jim Blossoms were formed in the back room at Tower Records, and meeting Bill Lean there and getting to become friends with him is basically how I got connected to the band. So
I love it. And in your
mm,
music, I hear a lot of Big Star. I hear a lot of REM. Were those some of those early
mhm.
Cheap Trick? Were those some of the early influences that informed the songwriting early on when you were first getting going?
Absolutely. I remember a friend of ours, one of my roommates who also worked at Tower. Him and a bunch of other guys went on a camping trip down to Mexico, and they took acid. And when they came back, everybody was listening to Big Star and Jonathan Richman.
Mm,
And so my roommate played me those records. This would have been like 1985. And right around that time is when the Replacements released Pleased to Meet Me, and they had that song about Alex Chilton in there. And so, yeah, I guess it was actually a few years after. That would have been 87 when my buddy came home listening to Big Star and Jonathan Richman. And another great power pop artist, a huge influence on me, was Tommy Keene,
yeah.
who I heard for the first time right around that time. And those records became like a big part of what I was trying to do as a songwriter. And it would be a few more years before I actually joined a real band. Jim Blossoms was the first band I was ever in. I was just a bedroom songwriter doing open mic nights and jam sessions with my friends and stuff. And I was finally putting together my first band with my buddies. And I went out and I bought a microphone. I was committed. And so I had a microphone, but I didn't even have a mic cable or anything to plug it into. But you know, I remember looking at it like, okay, well, here's the first step. And it was about a week after I bought that microphone that I got a call to audition for Gin Blossoms. And it was Bill Lean had called me, and I was at this point I was working at a different record store, Zia Records, across the street from Tower Records. And I answered the phone at Zia. Hello, this is Zia Records, Robin speaking. How can I help you? And it was Bill Lean calling from across the street at Tower Records. And he asked me to audition for Gin Blossoms. The Gin Blossoms had just gotten started. They had only been playing out for about a month and a half at that point. They were a brand new band, but they were already like, people like Bill and Doug were already relatively well known in our local music scene. So there was a lot of hype around the new band, but they only played out for about 6 weeks before they had to fire one of the original members. And so to replace him, I got the call. And again, never having been in a real band before, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And at first I said no, because, and I used the fact that I was starting my band um, as an excuse. And that night I went out with a friend of mine. And another advantage of working at record stores is you get free concert tickets all the time. So we had tickets to go see Timothy Leary give a talk. And we were on our way to see Timothy Leary. And I told my friend, yeah, the Gin Blossoms asked me to audition, but I said no. And my friend looked at me and he said, Robin, you're a fucking idiot. They are a real band. They're a working band. If you join that group, you're going to be immediately doing shows and immediately at the top of the scene or whatever. I can't, he wouldn't have used those words. He was way too cool to say top of the scene. But by time we got to the Timothy Leary concert, I said, I agreed, okay, you're right. I need to get the courage to audition for Gin Blossoms. And so the next morning I went to Tower Records where Bill was working, and I knocked on the back door and I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And so it was that night that I auditioned. That was a Wednesday. Bill called me Tuesday. Wednesday, I agreed to try out. I tried out. We rehearsed Wednesday. We rehearsed Thursday. And then we played 3 nights in a row, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So by Friday, I went to the music store and I bought a guitar. And in the first show, I was playing like 8 songs, and then they let me sing a couple. I'm like, well, do you know a little bit of soul? And was by Music Machine, I think was the name of that group. A little bit of soul, yeah, a little bit of soul. And so we kind of stormed through that. So they let me sing lead on, like a couple of covers. And then the Saturday night rolled around. I had learned like 3 more songs on guitar. And then Sunday night, I had learned like another 4 songs. So by Sunday night, I was performing in most of the set. And then it was just, I hit the ground running. And from the moment of my first rehearsal, we were just working all the time. It was just nonstop. We would be playing 4 or 5 nights a week. And we were the most popular band in town. So it was just packed bars and packed nightclubs. And we immediately started, we came right out of the gate with a big following and a lot of support. And we were very lucky. Tempe, Arizona was a perfect place to start a band in the late 1980s. There were a lot of clubs right around Arizona State University. It was one of the biggest colleges in the country. So there was just a huge audience. And those were in the days when college kids like to go out to bars and hear live music. I don't know what they do now, but it ain't that. And it was just sort of the perfect baptism. And I was just so lucky that I was in the right place at the right time, and I had the right skill set. And I've been able to build my entire life since then around membership in this great band. And I'm just so very fortunate to have found my place on planet Earth, and here we are in the future. And yeah, we're still going.
Well, we're all fortunate because of the great music you've put out. And is it correct that you weren't originally the singer when you joined? You were slated to be the guitar player. How did it end up that you took over lead vocals?
Well, as I mentioned, I was playing rhythm guitar and singing background vocals, and Jesse Valenzuela was our lead singer. And then they would let me sing like 2 songs a night. The first week I was singing 2 songs a night, and then by the second week I was singing like 4 songs, and it just doubled every week. And eventually I was singing nearly half of the show. And this was happening, you know, within a few months of when I joined the band. So by like May of '88, I was singing about half of the show. And Jesse, who is a great singer, and he was a really good front man. And I remember seeing the band before I joined, and being very impressed with Jesse. I didn't know him personally. So when I saw a lead singer, a guy fronting a band in my hometown, and I was really impressed with him, I just remember thinking, it's so great that there's a front man with this much charisma and talent in my town where I'm from. It was the first time I had seen anybody. Well, maybe not the first, but one of the few times I'd seen anybody with that level of ability. And then, you know, I joined the band and I was singing more and more and more. And then just one day, you know, a few months into it, Jesse came up and he said, "Hey, Rob, we're going to switch. You're going to be the lead singer and I'm going to play guitar. And you'll be the full-time lead singer." And I was so relieved because as a guitar player, I was way out of my depth. But aside from that, it had always been my dream to be the lead singer. That's always what I wanted to do. I was never interested in being a lead guitar player. I learned just enough guitar to be able to write songs and perform acoustically. And my heroes were people like Tom Petty and Robin Zander. So if I figured if if he doesn't have to play any leads, I don't either, you know. So I just never learned. I never became a real guitar player in that sense, and so it was a big relief to me to get the job as lead singer. And looking back with the perspective of time, what an unselfish move on Jesse's part.
Yeah.
When has that ever happened in rock and roll where you've got a lead singer of the band say to the guitar player, let's switch? um, you know, it was an amazing act of selflessness and doing what was best for the band. And fortunately for me, it's what he wanted to do. He preferred playing guitar, and he didn't want to front the band as much as he wanted to be in the band.
Yeah.
And so I was very lucky because I had spent most of my life up to that point like lip syncing in front of the mirror. So I was ready to go. And I've been, as I
Yeah.
said, very, very fortunate to have found my place in this world.
It's incredible. And that first album you recorded, Dusted in '89, had some of the iconic songs that you later recorded. Hey Jealousy, Follow You Down, Cajun Song, Idiot Summer. Were those part of the repertoire when you joined the band?
Uh, no, Hey Jealousy had just been written a few days before we made that record. Follow You Down actually was years and years later. But we Doug, when we formed the band, Doug already had a big batch of songs that did include "Found Out About You"
Found out
and
about you.
Lost Horizons. And then he had a few other songs, and Jesse brought in a few songs like Cajun Song and uh, Hands Are Tied. And so those were the kind of the foundational songs. And then Doug had a few other tunes at the time. Um, One in particular was called Dream With You, which if we had been able to continue on with Doug in the group, there's no doubt that that would have been a huge hit single at some point. I to this day, I don't really understand why we didn't record it for New Miserable Experience. But I would assume that if Doug had stayed in the band, it would have been on the next record. And it still just breaks my heart to try to imagine what could have happened if Doug had stayed in the band and we had been able to continue making records, because he and I were writing together and we had a lot of chemistry. There was a lot of tension because Doug was out of his mind and he had a lot of emotional and substance abuse issues. But the chemistry that Doug and I had was incredible. And I've said it before, but I truly believe that if Doug had somehow been able to survive as a member of the group, he and I, we would have been the Perry and Tyler of the 90s. We would have been the American version of Noel and Liam Gallagher. It was it was a really potent combination of singer and guitar player songwriter. And I was a songwriter before joining the band, but once I joined a band with Doug and Jesse in it, my songwriting immediately came up to another level. It's as if I suppose if you're the backup quarterback on the Patriots and you get to be around Tom Brady, well, then you're going to become a better quarterback. And that's what happened to me as a songwriter. Just having to compete with Jesse and Bill and Doug as songwriters raised my game. And I'm just really fortunate. Yeah.
And were they what's the word I'm looking for?
Receptive? No.
Yes. Yeah.
No.
Thank you.
No, Jesse was more kind than Doug about my songs, but when I would bring songs in, Doug didn't want to play my songs. And because, this was the first band I was ever in, he didn't really respect me very much as a musician. And so he didn't want to play my songs, and he would show it on stage. He would, just to show the audience his disinterest in my songs while we would be playing one of my tunes, he would literally just stop playing and go get a beer.
Wow.
And then come back to the stage. Just so disrespectful.
Yeah.
Or he would just go back to his amplifier and drink his beer and just kind of stand there. And then, and it was his way of sort of demonstrating that, he's basically saying to the audience, I didn't write this song. This is the new guys. And it was heartbreaking. It was really difficult. But, I turned in, we were doing some of my songs, and some of them were okay. Some of them were pretty good. But it wasn't until I wrote Allison Road that Doug and Jesse had to finally just accept that that I was getting good at it. And everyone in our audience and in the band immediately reacted to that song. And, I remember debuting it, and all the other local musicians that were at our show were coming up to me and going, that new song is great. That new song is great. And Doug overheard somebody complimenting Allison Road, and he kind of shouts over to me, the best thing about that song is my riff. It's just like, fuck you, Doug. You can't even just give me this, And so a couple of years back, as a side note, I in our hometown, we had a street named after Allison Road. And so you can see above the door here in my kitchen, yeah, I've got one of the street signs for the Allison Road sign. Here's some of my lunchbox and skateboard collection. But the Allison Road thing was a big deal. And when we were there at the press conference celebrating the renaming of that street, I said to the audience there that Doug used to say the best thing about that song is my riff, and that I know that if Doug were still alive today, he would be so jealous that I got a song, or I got a street named after one of my songs. He would be just livid with jealousy about that. And so yeah, take that, Doug.
That's one of the greatest.
I proved you.
One of the greatest songs ever. Love it.
Thank you very much.
And so that was on, obviously, New Miserable Experience. And I'm curious, how did it get from Dusted to getting linked up with A&M in order to re-record some of those songs and add the new ones for the new record?
Well, in 1988, the local music paper, the New Times. I know there's New Times all around the country, but the Phoenix New Times every year would have its Best of Phoenix issue, and it was a pretty big deal. And we were named in 1988. We were named the Best of Phoenix local band, and it was a big deal, and it was very, very exciting. And the New Times sponsored us to go to South by Southwest and perform as their representatives in 1989.
Wow.
So in '89, March of '89, we went to Austin to play at South by Southwest. We did our gig, and then immediately afterwards, we started getting business cards from A&R guys and stuff like that. And I remember Jesse saying before we went, he's like, "We're going to get signed. We're going to get signed when we go to South by Southwest." And he made it sound like we were going to get signed before we left Austin. But what happened was we did hook up with ASCAP, and the vice president at ASCAP was a dude who was our age. His name was Tom DeSavia, and he
Tom.
immediately, you know Tom?
Oh yeah.
All right,
Oh,
great.
yeah.
And so Tom immediately like took us under his wing, and we started going out to Hollywood once a month and doing the ASCAP showcase at the Coconut Teaser. And so we would get 5 songs, and we drove out to Hollywood every month for a year to do those ASCAP showcases. And we would sleep on Tom's couch and on his floor. And he was doing this with a bunch of different groups. So we became really close friends with a Canadian band called The Odds, who I'm sure you would love. And we've remained close friends with The Odds since first meeting them through Tom. And so, all right, so the timeline, South by Southwest '89. Then we started hanging out with ASCAP, doing the Coconut Teaser stuff. And then in 1990, we went back to South by Southwest as a part of the ASCAP showcase. And so that was the big bill for us. And it was one of the bigger shows you could be on at South by Southwest. I'm pretty sure we were on the bill with Eric Johnson that year. Either that or he was just there at our set. But also I remember meeting our manager at the time was so excited because Jody Stevens of Big Star was there. And Jody managed Ardent Recording Studios, and one of his job was to go to South by Southwest and pass out his business card and talk about the studio, promote the studio. So I remember being so excited that Jody Stevens of Big Star was at our show. That was kind of cool. And so by that point, we were being courted by most of the major labels. We had dinner with at least 6 different major labels, and we were being flown all around the country. A label would fly us to New York, and we'd have dinner with Warner Brothers or whoever, or fly out to Los Angeles, and we'd have dinner out there with Geffen or whoever it was. And I remember the A&R guy from MCA came to Phoenix and took us out to dinner, and we found out at dinner that he was the guitar player from the Zombies. And I was like, holy crap, this is so cool. And I just remember feeling, to quote Keith Richards, I remember feeling that we were on the front lines. You know, we were going somewhere. And anyway, so we right after we appeared in South by Southwest for the second time in 1990, it was within a few months of that we signed with A&M Records, a great label, a classic label with lots of great history. And our A&R guy, his name was Brian Huttenhauer, he had also signed Extreme and Soundgarden. And then he had just been promoted to vice president. So we were with the hottest A&R guy at the label. And so we knew, we had some sense that, you know, we were going to be watched after. And then we signed our publishing deal with Warner Brothers, and our A&R guy at Warner Brothers was Jim Cardillo, and he had just signed, or right after he signed us, he signed Soul Asylum and I think Smashing Pumpkins, and then he signed us, and then he signed Green Day like
Wow.
soon after that. So he was on a roll, and um, it was good to have this sense of knowing that we were going to get a real shot, But again, coming from where we came from, where our heroes were mostly bands like the Replacements and the Plimsolls, we never really expected to accomplish any more than those groups commercially. And I remember when our A&R guy called us, like soon after we signed, Brian gave me a call. We were just chatting, and I had been watching MTV, and I had just seen the new single from the Rembrandts was
Mhm.
on MTV, and so he and I were discussing it, and Brian said to me, "Well, that'll happen for you guys one day. You'll have a song." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, you'll get sooner or later. You guys are going to have a song that's like, going to make it and going to be on the radio and stuff." And I just remember, boom, my brain just, I'm like, really? You really think that, we're going to get as far as the Rembrandts? and, um, and he was like, yeah. And even though we had signed a major label deal and we were working with all of these people and we were with this great classic label, it still just amazed me to realize that they thought we were going to have a hit, or at least that there was the potential for it or whatever. And so that was a pretty significant moment for me when Brian said that. Yeah, one day you guys will have a song.
Did they have a sense? I mean, you had a lot of great songs at that point. It was "Hey Jealousy," "Found Out About You," and then "Until I Fall Away" was on the record. Did they have a sense of which song they they thought was going to be big, and did you have a sense of which one you thought would be the big single?
Well, I think we all knew that "Found Out About You" was a no brainer. We knew that that was the hit or a hit. And so I'm sure that they saw that. But aside from that, nobody was talking about Hey Jealousy as being a single.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't think of it as a single. And then, but after we got signed, I remember Doug and I talking about it. And I said to him, we need to write like a rock and roll song for our first single. Like something. And I said to him, it's like a Cheap Trick song. It needs to be like an upbeat rocker, and that should be our first single. And Doug took this in, and a few days later, he showed up with the chord progression for "Hold Me Down,"
Mhm.
which is on "New Miserable Experience." And so he had the first verse and the chorus, and he showed it to me, and I immediately started writing more lyrics, and I came up with the intro and the bridge and the breakdown section or whatever. And that was the only song that Doug and I co-wrote together that actually got recorded. And so it's very special to me now, uh, because it almost didn't happen and it almost didn't make the record. But anyway, Doug and I were in cahoots. Even after we had to fire him, he and I were still uh, in agreement that "Hold Me Down" should be the first single. And I was trying to influence the label that "Hold Me Down" should be the single, but they didn't listen to me, and they went with "Hey Jealousy." And anyway, there you go. There's that story. So
And
yeah,
and
there we are.
and during those sessions, Doug got fired, and I'm curious because he was obviously a major songwriter and part of this band. Was there any doubt whether the band would be able to continue or grow from there, or did it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a great deal of doubt. We were terrified when we realized. Well, the first thing that happened is that Doug was barely able to play on the record. He was functional for like the first 8 days, and most of what you hear of Doug on that record was recorded while we were recording the drums, and he really wasn't able to play much after that. And so, about 5 weeks or 4 weeks into the sessions, I think we were in Memphis. Oh yeah, and I need to mention we decided to record in Memphis.
All right, Arden. Yeah.
Ardent Recording Studios. We had our producer John Hampton had mixed one of our songs for a movie soundtrack, and we were debating all these producers. You know, do we want to record with Ed Stasium, and do we want to record with Don Dixon, or uh, and I was throwing out really expensive names. I can't remember what the name of the guy is, but the guy who was doing all those Aerosmith records, I want to say Bainhorn, was that his name? But in any case, I was throwing out names like that, and I remember A&R guys just going, "No, no, you can't afford him." But uh, we were talking about producers, and it was Jesse that pointed out to me that John Hampton, who had mixed one of our songs for this movie soundtrack, that he had recorded the Replacements and Tommy Keene. And the moment I heard that, I'm like, that's the guy. Let's go do that. And then when I made the connection to Ardent Studios, which was basically built for Big Star,
Yeah.
and I realized we were going to be a part of that legacy, I immediately called everyone in the band and said, let's go with John Hampton. Let's go to Memphis and record at Ardent. So anyway, now getting back to the story of Doug, we were there for a total of 6 weeks. About 4 weeks in, it was decided that Doug needed to just be sent home because it was so bad. Have you ever seen that movie Leaving Las Vegas with
Yeah.
Nicolas Cage?
Yeah.
All right. Imagine that was your lead guitar player. All right. That's what was happening. It was self-destruction on such a scale that it was destroying everything, and we weren't sure if we were even going to be able to finish the record. So it was decided to send Doug home, and so we still had at least another week of tracks where we needed to finish up vocals and a few lead guitars and tambourines, and just polish it up. And it was during that week Doug had left town, and Jesse said to me, Rob, let's go out together. Let's go have a drink. And so Jesse and I sat at this bar in Memphis, and we had a really frank discussion about whether or not we could continue the group. And what would it be if we did go on without Doug, and what would our responsibilities be, and could we both handle that leadership role? And Jesse and I came out of that bar, and basically said, yeah, let's try to keep this thing moving forward. And you know here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are.
And what, after
Mm.
Doug left the band and Hey Jealousy became a big hit, what was his reaction towards that?
Well, he was going through a lot. He was very bitter, and he was focusing most of his anger on me. Like, he and Bill had been best friends since freshman year of high school, but he didn't turn any of his venom towards Bill. Doug was intimidated by Jesse, and
Mm.
so he didn't aim any of his venom at Jesse. Um, it was all aimed at me. So Doug, he was basically just going around town. I mean, he was this bar urchin, and he would sit there at the bar and talk shit about me. And he was telling people that I was stealing from him, and that um, I was a no talent coat riding son of a bitch. And he he was really, really cruel, and it was tough. It was really tough for me. And there was one time where we had been out on tour, and we came home after months on the road, and I went to the bar where we all played a million times. That was our hangout. And almost as soon as I walk into the bar, on one hand, I'm kind of a local celebrity, so people are reacting like, "Hey, cool, yeah, rah, rah." And almost immediately, I looked up, and Doug came at me. Doug was there, and he came at me, and he just hauled back and full on fist to the face, and he knocked me down. I didn't pass out, but he hit me hard, and I went down. And when I looked up, people were restraining him, and he was just shrieking at me, "You son of a bitch, you thieving son of a bitch." And it was just, heartbreaking and humiliating. And, so I left, I went home. And the next night I was sitting at home, and the doorbell rings, and I answered the door, and it was Doug. And so obviously, I mean, he was stewing on all of these things as well. And so he came in, and we sat together for a few hours. This is one of the last times I got to see him alive, one of the three last times that I got to visit with him. And, when we talked about the whole thing, and it was hard. It was heartbreaking. And at one point he said, "Well, you betrayed me." And I'm like, "You're the one that threw all this away. We were waiting for you to be our leader. And we were all there to support you, and you're the one that turned on us and turned it into a nightmare. This is not something that we wanted to do. We weren't looking for an excuse to get you out of the band. We wanted to save you, and you showed us that we couldn't." And he's like, "Well," and he accepted that. I could see from his expression that he accepted that. He said, "Well, you still betrayed me." He just wouldn't, he couldn't just admit that it was his fault, you know.
Wow.
Um, but he and I, during the course of that conversation, we talked about "Hold Me Down," and he was upset that I was getting co-writing credit for it, and I'm like, "Doug, we wrote this song together." And he's like, "Well, you should give me all the credit." And um, I thought about it for a while, and I remember having a conversation with Jesse about it. And Jesse said, "No, Rob, you should absolutely take co-writing credit for that song because you were there, you were a part of it. It was a song you wrote together." And so I called Doug, and I said, "I'm taking co-writing credit for Hold Me Down." At this point, we were actually putting together the credits and the album cover. This is before it was released, but I told him, "I'm taking co-writing credit for the song." I said, "You can have all of the publishing money. I won't touch a dime
Mm.
of the publishing money, but I am taking co-writing credit for that song." And he just erupted, "You son of a bitch, you thieving son of a bitch." He was just screaming at me, and he hung up on me. And it's just like, there's so much regret and pain that I feel when I think about these things. And the moment Doug comes into my brain, which happens every single day, I think about him all the time. But the moment, it's like a lifetime of mixed emotions. Everything I've ever felt, every high, every low, everything he ever said, good or bad, every inside joke that he and I had together, it all floods into me in like a moment. All I have to do is think Doug, and all there, the entire experience. And I'm to this day, as I say, I'm filled with regret with being unable to know what we could have accomplished together. And I think we could have done so much. And I honestly believe that he would be really proud of me. And um,
I love that. Yeah.
and I am comforted by that thought. No matter what he said to all of these people and all the shit he used to talk about me and how I was the villain, I have no doubt. I have no doubt that he would be very proud of me. So,
I love it. I love it. And during that time, and we're going to talk about the new tour you have with Toad the Wet Sprocket. And I found that interesting that at that time, it's what, 32 years ago, you were opening for Toad the Wet Sprocket on their headlining tour. And I'm
yeah,
curious.
that was right when New Miserable Experience was released. Like the day that it was released, we began that tour opening for Toad
Do you,
at the Trocadero in Philadelphia.
do you have any specific memories? Because that must have been one of your first bigger tours as well. I'm curious if there's any memories specific that stand out from that series of shows.
Well, there are several. It was an exciting time because Toad was breaking hard. They were at the top of the charts, and their album went gold like a week into that tour, or 2 weeks into that tour. And we were out with them for a long time. It was like October through December. Other than like 2 weeks, we took off and we went out with our label mates, Delamitri.
Hmm.
And I remember fighting with the label about it. It's like, we don't want to leave Toad. We want to stay out here with Toad. And they're like, no, you're going out with Delamitri. And their reasoning was that we were going to go back through some of the markets we had just hit with Toad. So that would put us back on the marquee in all of those major cities like Boston and Philadelphia and Cleveland and Detroit. And we hit all of these major cities again with Delamitri. And then we went back out with Toad again. So it was it was a long tour that we were out with Toad, like 2.5 months. It began the day the album came out, and yeah, there were some really great moments. One in particular, I remember after a show, we were our label had put together a cassette with some B-sides and a couple of tunes from the records, and we were giving those away at the show. And I remember the first time somebody came up and asked me to sign one of them. And then there was another great moment where we were palling around with Toad backstage after the show, and there were all of these kids from the show. All of the people from the audience were backstage. We're all outside standing next to our van and their bus. And, that contrast was really sharp. You see the difference between your van and a tour bus,
Yeah.
and you know where you're at. And but we were all there together, both groups, completely surrounded by fans, autographing stuff. And I remember looking up and knowing and just having this moment where I realized we have crossed over into something new. We are a part of something bigger than what we had been a part of before. And as much as I was proud of our local scene and being a big part of our local scene, I knew that at this moment we were a part of a national scene. And it was a great moment, and we all had to eventually we had to get in the van and drive away. And there's crowds of fans waving to our van as we got out of the parking lot, and we're all in there just yucking it up and laughing and stuff. And I had kind of announced to the band, I said, this was really special, guys, and we have crossed over, and I basically told them what I just told you. We're a part of something bigger now. And that was a great moment. That was a really great moment. Another really fun moment on that tour was when there was a warrant issued for my arrest for inciting a riot. And this was a thing that I was always proud of, because it's like, holy shit, I'm like Jim Morrison. I've got an entire sheriff's department trying to find me to arrest me for inciting a riot. I was like, wow. I was hiding in the hotel. just like hoping they wouldn't know where we were staying. What happened? We were playing at this place in Johnson City, Tennessee, and we were playing at an old church, and the stage is there, and there's an organ, because it's a church. There's a big wooden organ like right in front of the stage. It's about a foot or so away from the stage, and there was a sign on the top of the organ pointed right to the stage that said, "Do not stand on the organ." Because it would have been very simple for me to just step off the stage and be on this nice big platform, which was about 4 by 6 feet. And it was right at the same height. And they didn't really have a crowd barrier. They just kind of had a rope on the other side of the organ. And the crowd was on the other side of the organ. It was a packed house. I noticed there was only 2 security guards. And there was a moment where I looked over at Jesse in between songs and I said, I think I'm going to cause some trouble. And Jesse kind of looked at me and he just shrugged and, yeah, go for it. And so I grabbed the microphone and I said to the crowd, "Hey, I don't think there's enough security here to hold you guys back. You should all like jump this barrier and come up to the stage." And the place just went ape shit. And we launch into a song, and I don't know what it was, but we're playing full volume, and I look up and there's two college kids standing on the organ waving that sign at me. They're shaking the sign at me. And so super exciting. Great moment for the band. Literally ripped the roof off that joint. And then it was like, as soon as we finished, my tour manager's like, "The cops are on the way. They called the cops, and there's been a warrant issued for your arrest for inciting a riot." I was like, "What?" And so I don't remember how I got to the hotel. I don't think it could have been in the van. Chances are the hotel was a few blocks away. But I got to the hotel, and I just remember holed up in my room smoking pot and just like, holy shit, holy shit. And like a few days after that, we stopped in Memphis in the middle of the tour, just for a night off. We stopped in Memphis, and I went over to Ardent, and there was a band recording in Studio A where we made The Miserable Experience. They're called the Afghan Wigs.
Yeah.
And so I went and I was hanging out with the Afghan Wigs, and I told them the story about how I had a warrant issued for my arrest. I was just so proud.
Did they ever come? What ended up? You didn't go to jail, I'm guessing.
No, they either one of two things: either A, they never found me, or two, it was bullshit and there was never any warrant issued for my arrest. I'm perfectly willing to accept that this was just somehow like some exaggeration on somebody's part, but for me it was a heroic moment of true rock spirit.
That is rock star. I love that.
Yeah. So Toad put us on probation. At this point, like, their management wanted us off the tour because we were causing problems like this from time to time. And there were a few violations of etiquette along the way where, like, I went into their dressing room once and drank some of their stuff. And so we were already on thin ice with Toad at this point. And their management wanted us off the tour, but Toad stood up for us. And I think it might be specifically Dean, the bass player, might have really stood up for us and kept us on that tour. And I don't get to spend a whole lot of time with Toad anymore, but we are brothers, and we shared these really great moments together early in our careers, and we are connected in a very intimate way that that if you're a touring rock band and you become close friends with somebody, you know, a lot of those friendships last a long time, but there's something really key to our relationship with Toad. And it's a part of so many people's memories of the early 90s, having been to those shows. The tour was a smash success. You know, I mean, it was clubs, but every club was packed. Every show was a blowout. And it was a really exciting time for rock and roll.
Yeah.
1992, 1993. That was a really exciting time for rock and roll.
Amazing, amazing. Those are
Yeah,
great stories. Thank you for sharing those.
my
Love that.
my pleasure, my pleasure.
Well,
So, yay, Toad the Wet Sprocket going out on tour with them
yeah.
next week. And just today, I was recording vocals for a track that we're putting together to get. Toad already recorded all the tracks. It's we're doing a cover of Driver 8 by
Oh,
REM.
yeah. Yeah. Beautiful.
And so just today, I just got home a couple nights ago. I'd been on the road for almost a month, and before I left, there had been some flooding in my basement, so I had to take my studio apart. I was unable to complete the tracks. But today I was able to get down into the studio and record my vocal tracks. And so I just this afternoon, I was recording with Toad the Wet Sprocket in preparations for a tour with Toad the Wet Sprocket.
That's
So
awesome.
they are my brothers to the end. I love them all to death, and I really enjoy being around them. And I'm looking forward to the tour.
Are you
Yeah.
guys gonna do Driver 8 live during the
I
tour?
believe so. I'm
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing it during Toad's set, and that's how it was pitched to me. We were going to make the record, we are going to put out a video, and then we would be doing the song during Toad's set. And then I'm hoping to get my bandmates to learn something that we can have everybody up on stage with us at the end of our set as well. So I'm in negotiations with my bandmates to get them to agree to that.
That'd be
So
awesome.
either way, it's going to be a great tour. Whenever I'm around those guys, I spend a lot of time with Todd and Dean, and it's going to be a great time.
You think there's any chance you're gonna incite a riot at one of the shows?
Absolutely no chance. I have been tamed. I have been thoroughly tamed over the years. I've sort of pushed, you know, on stage. I've pushed it, and there have been times where I've said the wrong thing, and I've tried to challenge the audience and said the wrong thing. And I'm at a point now where I don't want to make trouble for my bandmates, for my booking agent, for our management. I try to set the standard of being a working rock and roll professional, and I try to create a connection between the stage and the audience so that every night the people in the audience feel like they're a part of it and that it's about them, which it truly is. And uh, I'm a little bit bored with my stage banter. I'm kind of in a rut right now. Like, what am I supposed to say to get people riled up or whatever? I'm going through a thing where I'm not verbally connecting with the audience the way I have in the past. But one thing I am very careful not to do is piss off the promoter, piss off our booking agent, piss off my bandmates. You don't ever talk shit about other bands. I have made those mistakes. Oh, can I tell you one of the story about that? Oh, this is brutal. We were playing up in Sturgis. We're on the bill with Wolf Mother, Live, the Black Crows, and Nickelback. We're sharing the stage with all these bands. And at the time, Wolf Mother, their music was being used in those iPod commercials, those early generation iPod commercials. So their Wolf Mother song was everywhere. And so we're on stage doing our set. I think it was Wolf Mother, then Live, and then us, and then the Black Crowes, and then Nickelback was the headline. So we're on stage, and I started talking about Wolf Mother. I'm like, this is like the hippest band in the world. This is one of the hottest bands in the world. I'm like, we're not hip anymore. Live isn't hip anymore. Nickelback isn't hip anymore, but we are sharing the stage with the hippest band in the world, Wolf Mother. We finished our set, and Nickelback's tour manager was waiting on the side of the stage to berate us, to berate me. And they didn't know who said the thing about Nickelback not being very hip anymore. So they went right up to Jesse, which is for me really bad news that Jesse's going to get in trouble for something I did. So the tour manager for Nickelback is just shouting at Jesse, "How dare you? Why would you ever?" And so I kind of got out of there, but I knew that I had fucked up, and there were a lot of people angry. And I got to the dressing room, and my bandmates were all fucking shrieking at me, like, "Robin, you don't ever talk shit about the headliner." And I'm like, I was trying to praise Wolf Mother, I tried to make a joke out of it or whatever, but I think it was pretty harmless. You got to have pretty fucking thin skin if that line is
Right.
really going to affect you. But anyway, so it was all over backstage that I had been talking shit about Nickelback. The whole thing just boiled down to that fact that I had been on stage talking shit about Nickelback. And so I actually went and found Nickelback, and I went up to that guy. I don't remember his name, but the lead singer of Nickelback, and we were chatting, and I said, "Dude, I'm really sorry about what happened, and I hope it's all cool or whatever." And then he was like, "Oh yeah, no worries, it's all good and whatever." And then one of his crew or management came up and said, "Oh, that's the guy that said the blah blah blah." And after chatting for 10 minutes, where everything was cool, all of a sudden he's like, "You're the guy that said that?" He's like, "Fuck you." And he just stormed off. And he was like, "Fuck you." And I was like, okay. Uh, so I've I've pissed off Nickelback. And so I remember talking with the Black Crowes about this. I was so embarrassed all day long. I felt terrible. And I was hanging out with a couple of the guys from the Black Crowes, and I'm like, the only reason I didn't mention you is because I forgot you were on the bill.
That's great.
Oh God. So anyway, I have learned my lessons. I have done
Yeah.
this enough to where if you're doing a private show, you you never say anything that is going to give the impression that you've got an attitude or you're not thrilled to be there.
Yeah.
I'm a savvy veteran, and I do my job with pride and enthusiasm. And when we're on a package tour with our friends like Toad and Vertical Horizon, or anytime we're around our buddies Sugar Ray or Fastball or whatever, I go out of my way to try to set the standard for performance, for professionalism, for being willing to promote the tour. And then I try to bring the spirit when it comes to backstage. I want to create a vibe where everyone knows that the whole point of it all is to perform rock and roll music for people, and that's our purpose, that's the privilege. And I go out of my way to, as I say, try to set the standard. So
And you do it very well. I've seen a few of the package tours over the last 10 years or so, and I I love every time I see you guys play. I love it, and you nail it. And
thanks,
I was
excellent.
going to ask you a question of like how the band has been that core of Bill, Jesse, you, Scotty have been together for a long time now, and I was going to ask how you keep that together. And it sounds like part of that answer is the professionalism and just
Yeah,
knowing how to keep it together.
exactly. It's a matter of loyalty to each other. I think it was Jesse or Bill said to me once, probably 20 years ago or something, you know, managers come and go, publishers, recording contracts, they come and go. We have to stay loyal to each other. And so I operate with that in mind. My partnership with my bandmates is the single most important thing about any of this. And I would, you know, despite how frustrating it can be, I would never betray those guys. But the point I'm trying to make is that above all else, you have to be
Yeah.
loyal to your bandmates and your partners, and that's and yeah, you have to be a professional. You can't be at the airport at 6 o'clock in the morning, all pissed off
Yeah.
and making a scene and embarrassing your partners. Everybody's got to be a pro, and we've all found our way there. You know, it wasn't easy, but that's thankfully that's where we've ended up, and I think that's one of the reasons that the four of us have been together so
Amazing.
long. Yeah.
You know, for anybody that was in their teens or 20s, Empire Records was a landmark album. Any music fan, and that song "Till I Hear It From You" was a massive hit. And I love knowing that it was co-written. You co-wrote it with Marshall Crenshaw, who's one of the great songwriters. And I'm just curious about how that came together. And yeah, if you could just tell me a little of the backstory of
Sure,
the
sure.
song.
I've told the story many times, but I'll try to break it down quickly. A&M came to us and said that they were going to be putting out the soundtrack to this movie next summer, and that we would have the lead single on the movie soundtrack. And they were that clear about it. You need to go write. They said you need to go write a hit, and it's going to be the lead single for this movie soundtrack. And we were like, okay, well, this is a lot of pressure, and this would be the first thing that we had done after the first songwriting we had to do for the label without Doug Hopkins. So that I think they told us about the soundtrack in January. Within a few weeks of that, Jesse called me and he said, "Hey, I co-wrote a song with Marshall Crenshaw. We need you to finish the lyrics." And I was like, "What?" Like, you know, if I had written a song with Marshall Crenshaw, I would have called everybody I knew that day and said, "Oh my God, I just wrote a song with Marshall Crenshaw." Um, he made so many great records. We used to cover a couple of his tunes. His album "Mary Jean and Nine Others," produced by Don Dixon, who also produced the Smithereens
Yeah.
and REM. Mary Jean and Nine Others was an album that I played the snot out of when I was working at Zia Records in Tempe. I played that album so much, alongside the Smithereens, Green Thoughts, both produced by Don Dixon. Both came out right around the same time. So it was a big deal to have a song co-written by Marshall Crenshaw. Jesse had the basic idea for the song. He gave it to Marshall, and Marshall added some melodic improvements to it. Like I believe the descending bit on the chorus was Marshall's contribution. I could be wrong about that. So the lyrics for the choruses were written, but there was nothing for the verses or the bridge. And Jesse gave it to me. It was a cassette. And so it was an instrumental cassette, except for the choruses where Jesse was singing along. And so I dumped the cassette into my ADAT and I started trying to work on the lyrics. And I remember thinking, and I've told this many times, but it's so true. I had a moment where I thought, all I need to do is not fuck this up. And I knew there was a lot of pressure on me to finish the song, that the label was waiting for it, that Marshall Crenshaw was going to hear it. You know, there was a lot going through my head. And so what I did is I thought about it logically. Here's the chorus. How do I tell the rest of the story? And so I had to work backwards and think about it, how lyrically I could lead lead the verses right up to that moment where the chorus begins and you hear "Till I Hear It From You." So I knew that I needed to have an incomplete sentence at the end of the verse that landed on "Till I Hear It From You." And I just kind of went backwards, and I just sort of reverse engineered what the story was that the chorus was trying to tell. So this all happened so fast. So January, they tell us about it. By the end of January, maybe early February, I was writing the lyrics. We went into the studio in March. We did a demo of it in our own little practice studio. And then in March, we went into a real studio. John Hampton came out from Memphis and we recorded in Phoenix. And so we recorded it in March. We made the video sometime in like late April or early May. And it was released and at the top of the charts by June. And so the machinery, I remember realizing that the machinery of the music industry was behind us.
Yeah.
And that we were a part of that old school music scene system, like the Beatles writing a song in the van after the show, and then it's going on the record they need to make in time for Christmas. It was that sort of experience where I realized we are a part of a huge industry, and we were tasked with providing this product, and we delivered a solid tune. And the machinery of the music industry, all we had to do is write anything that wasn't shitty, and it would have happened like that. Fortunately for us, we wrote a really solid tune that for our catalog went on to become a classic, and as you say, became a big part of the soundtrack of the times. So it was a huge success for the band. We were under tremendous pressure, and we delivered, and I'm very proud of it.
Amazing. And last question for you. The
Yeah.
last record you guys put out was 2018 Mixed Reality. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, is there any plans for future recordings or new music that you're all writing, or is there going to be any new music played on the tour?
Not on the tour, but we are writing, and I'd like to have a record in the can by next summer. So I've already told my bandmates this a couple of times. I'm also writing songs with the Smithereens
Awesome.
for a Smithereens record, and so now I'm actually in a band with Marshall Crenshaw, and we're
Yes.
called the Smithereens. You
Right.
know, it's
Right.
amazing. And Marshall does more shows with them than I do, but there've been a couple times where we both are there on stage fronting the band and kind of tag teaming the lead vocals. We're going to be doing that coming up in early December. We're playing in Carteret, New Jersey. That's the Smithereens' hometown. And Marshall and I will both be there on stage. And so we're working on a Smithereens record, and I've got a bunch of other shows with them lined up in November. We're going to be doing at least 3 shows on the East Coast. We're going to be playing in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Denver, and maybe a couple dates in California. So it's an absolute thrill and huge amount of pride for me to be a part of the Smithereens, and
And
um, and that connection. You know, I mean, it starts with being at Tower Records, listening to those REM records.
yeah.
And and there's Don Dixon and Mitch Easter on the album cover, and then a few years later working at Zia Records, and the Smithereens came in to do an in-store appearance to promote Green Thoughts, and I got to meet the band and go to the show and hang out with them backstage, and then over the years bumped into them a few times. Pat DiNizio actually made a solo record in my studio in 1997, and um, and then we went on to make a record with Don Dixon. And when we were recording Mixed Reality, there we are in Mitch Easter's studio. Mitch was engineering it, and Don was producing. And just those two guys are so cool. And there's just being around them was very inspiring. And every time I would do my vocals, I would warm up with a Smithereens song or a Marshall Crenshaw song, something that Don had produced. because these records were really important to me and they were very influential. And then and now here I'm a part of the Smithereens. So hopefully, Jim Blossoms, when we get around to recording, I would very much like to record with Don Dixon again. So fingers crossed that I can get my bandmates to be willing to spend the money. But the Smithereens, it's our plan to make a record with Don Dixon. So if that happens, the 20-year-old Robin inside me is just going to be freaking out, and I'm going to show up with my A game.
That's awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Robin, thank you so much for all the stories. Thank you so much for all the great music.
Thank
And
you, Scott.
I'll be coming to the show when you guys play in Calabasas in October, and I look forward to seeing y'all. And good luck.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. This has been very cathartic for me. I talked a little bit more than I thought I would, and honestly, I've been doing so many interviews lately. I was just like, oh God, I got to come up with a way to say this differently, But yeah, I was glad the conversation kind of took us someplace I haven't been lately. So it's been my pleasure. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Robin.
Peace and love.
I'll see you soon.
Rock away.
Later, Rob.
Cheers. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Legends Podcast by All Day Vinyl. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate it, share it, subscribe, and follow us and check us out at All Day Vinyl on Instagram and YouTube.